and that doesn't make any sense.
All right, so
So
I guess I'll start with a
the idea
simple
is
question.
that to
How are you doing?
have individual rights, I'm doing great.
All right, so I got your book right here. Uh, Pretty quick read. Yeah, I think you mentioned before that you had a lot more articles on abortions. Is there any reason you picked out these specific ones?
There's a fair number of others that weren't published in that book. It is a collection of essays that were previously published. The ones that we picked to put in the book were just the ones that we thought were and here by we, I mean the editors at the Ayn Rand Institute's publication New Ideal, because these were all published on New Ideal. We picked the ones we thought were just the most fundamental, the ones that were the most timeless, that cut to the core of the abortion controversy.
Okay. Is there a reason you specifically want to talk about abortions?
Yeah. So my background is in philosophy. Used to be a philosophy professor, and then came to work at the Ayn Rand Institute. And what we do at ARI is promote, educate people about Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. Rand had I think, a very distinctive position on the subject of abortion, a very uncompromising position. She was, I think, in favor of abortion rights. And so one reason that I wanted to write about this topic is just because it's timely. It's obviously with the overturn of Roe v. Wade this past summer, it's definitely been in the news. So there's an audience that wants to hear about this issue and Rand's view on the issue. I also think Rand's view is right. And it's an important issue because I think it's a crucial liberty that women need to live. And it's also a topic that interests me as a philosopher because I think it's one of the rare cultural controversies where basically every major philosophic question intersects in a single controversy. Your view on abortion rights obviously tells you something about your view of politics, your view of the role of government, your view of the nature of rights, what kinds of freedoms we are entitled to, what kinds we aren't. It tells you something about your view of morality because your position on abortion is going to depend upon whether or not you think, for instance, that people have an obligation to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others, whether it's unborn fetus or the demands of a god, as opposed to the view that people have a right to pursue their own happiness and that they have every moral reason to do so. It intersects with big questions about knowledge, what we call epistemological questions in philosophy, because it relates to the question of how do we know what's true about the universe? Do we figure out whether or not the fetus is an individual human being with rights by consulting our feelings, by consulting our faith, or do we go on the basis of the observable scientific evidence? And last of all, it definitely bears on your view and depends on your view of just the basic nature of reality, because I mean, I think at the fundamentally, the anti-abortion rights position depends on a religious viewpoint, which means it depends on the idea that there's some kind of supernatural consciousness who rules over us and who determines the rules of the universe just by virtue of his will. And so that's a very different view of reality from a naturalistic scientific view, which says, no, there's no such being. The universe is what it is. It follows the laws of its own identity, of its own nature, and we have to figure out what they are. It's not that there's some being that's dictating them.
Do you think the the push against abortion rights is mainly religious, because there's a lot of secular groups or left-wing groups that I can think of that do believe life begins conception, like secular pro-life humanists, Democrats for Life, progressive anti-abortion uprising, and there was also one called All Our Lives. I don't think they're active anymore. Do you think they
Yeah,
have?
there are definitely secular leaning people who are opposed to abortion rights. But what I said a moment ago was, I think fundamentally it comes from a religious outlook. And what I mean by that is that the people oppose abortion either because they directly think that abortion is immoral and that the fetus is a human being with rights because they think that's what their religion tells them. Or they may not think their religion tells them this because they might not even have a religion. But I think that religious ways of thinking about morality and about rights have really permeated our culture in all kinds of ways. Christianity was the dominant intellectual worldview for 1500, 1700 years. And that's going to leave a mark on a culture, even among secular people. And I think that many secular people still have fundamentally religious ways of thinking about morality and about the nature of rights. We could talk more about that if you want, in particular, about how that works out. But I mean, I don't think there's an actually rational scientific argument you can give for why, for instance, the fetus has some kind of rights. And the people who think you can, I think, end up drawing on notions and concepts that they knowingly or unknowingly are getting from religious ideology.
Have there been any pro-life arguments that you think might have some merit to it, like the late-term abortions, for example?
Well, one thing I should say is and maybe this sounds picky, but I never refer to that position as pro-life.
Okay.
I call it the anti-abortion position.
Okay.
I think that calling it, and I'm not correcting you, but I'm correcting the people who've popularized that idea. I mean, I think it is a severely slanted way of describing the position because it presupposes that there is a life there in the form of the fetus that matters for our purposes. And it also evades the fact that abortion is necessary for women's lives. And so if you it's actually an anti-life position for lots of reasons we could talk about. But is there a plausible anti-abortion position? I mean, there are some that are, I guess, more plausible than others. And there are some that end up, I mean, they have more persuasive power. I ultimately don't agree with any of them. And you mentioned the question about late-term abortion, and I'm one of the few people you may find who will go to the mattresses to defend abortion rights up until birth. So part of what's plausible to some people, I think, about why that's a incorrect position is that, in fact, there are many pregnancies, which I think if you ended them at the late term, a very late into pregnancy, it would be wrong. It would be immoral. It would be irrational. There would be no good reason for the woman to do it. But the position that I'm taking isn't about the morality per se of late-term abortion. It's the woman's right to have it. And there are lots of things that we often think you have the right to do, even if it would be wrong for you to choose it, but it's still your choice. Now, as it happens, I think it's a red herring. I think that the kinds of cases where it would be irresponsible or irrational to have an abortion at a late time into pregnancy, they're not the kinds of cases where it actually happens. It's not like there are women who, or it's not like there are many, if any, women who are perfectly healthy. They have a healthy fetus. They can expect to have a healthy birth, and then at 8.5 months they just change their mind. I don't want to have a baby anymore, and then they have an abortion. This is not the reason why there are late-term abortions, and the vast majority of them happen, as far as we can tell, and it's hard to get data on this, but as far as we can tell, the vast majority of them happen because of complications that threaten the health of the woman, where it's or where the health of the fetus is already imperiled, so that if it is born, it's going to live a very short life suffering. And those are the biggest reasons why they actually happen. So in those kinds of cases, where forcing the woman to go through with the pregnancy is going to be, make her go through hell and make the child go through hell, it's totally moral for her to have it, and all the more reason she should have the right. But of course, I do think that there are things we have the right to do, even when it's wrong for us to choose them. And so if it really is our freedom, then you have to allow that sometimes people have the right to do the wrong thing. But it's a red herring, because most of the time late-term abortions happen. It wouldn't be wrong either. And of course, the vast majority of abortions that happen earlier in pregnancy, I think, are completely morally justified.
Yeah, so yeah, I pretty much agree with that. Which thing about the late-term abortions, I actually didn't realize that majority of them were due to health reasons for the mother or the fetus. I was actually really happy, because that makes the pro-choice position a bit easier on me. So you've heard of Secular Pro-Life, correct? The organization?
Yeah, I think I have.
I've been on their website, and they were actually trying to claim that majority are actually not due to health reasons. The majority of late-term abortions are not due to health reasons. Do you think, like you said, majority of them are in fact due to like the health of the mother? The fetus might not, or the baby might not live like a long or healthy life, which is the reason why behind that.
I'd have to see their claims and their data. I've just never seen. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that we don't have a lot of good data on what the reasons for any abortions are, because it's not data that's required in most places. The most the most kind of semi-plausible argument I've seen, contrary to my statement, has worked by messing around with the definition of late term.
Mm-hmm.
And if you define late term to be anything after the second trimester, then yeah, it's going to look like there's a lot more elective abortions that are late term. But that means anything after 6 months, but that's not where the controversy really is. Like, people get disgusted and morally outraged at late-term abortions when they find out that it's like within weeks of when the child would otherwise come to term. And those are the ones that I'm saying are mostly for health reasons, either the mothers or the fetuses. So yeah, if you mess around with the definition of late term, you can make it look much worse than that. But it's still, I think, all fundamentally a kind of smokescreen for making getting past the really fundamental question, which is, does a woman have a right to an abortion early in pregnancy? That's what's most important. So if we were going to have a political compromise in this country, where a position that I didn't completely agree with, but was, because of the fact that people disagree, we have to compromise sometimes. I'm not happy about it, but that's the political reality. If we have a position where women are able to get abortions in the first trimester, and it's illegal after that, I would disagree with that position. I would disagree with that system, but I would think that's at least giving them a chance to be able to have a choice. And it can be inconvenient, can be and unjustly inconvenient, but by spending so much time talking about late-term abortions that almost never happen, the anti-abortion side of this argument is able to make it sound like that's where the real debate is. But in fact, the most important debate is about whether it happens early in pregnancy and whether it can happen early in pregnancy. And they're trying to outlaw that by cobbling it together with the late-term question.
So a lot of the most common pro-choice arguments are something like my body, my choice, and one I've heard was if men could get pregnant, then abortion would be I forgot the word they used, but you probably heard that quote. And another one was like men can have sex with 100 women, get them all pregnant. Women can have sex with 100 men, only get pregnant once. We're limiting the wrong gender. Do you have a problem with some of those arguments? Do you think they're all completely valid?
I don't think they're all completely valid. Some of them are better than others. The my body, my choice isn't really an argument. It's a slogan. And as a slogan, it's not bad, but it's not, it's good as far as it goes, but it could go a lot further. You need to go a lot further to give a full argument. So one issue is this: you have the right to do with your body as you please, but as long as it doesn't violate the rights of other people. So I could say to somebody, my body, my choice. Hey, I've got these hands. I can strangle you with them if I want. But of course, that's ridiculous. And so to be able to fully address the anti-abortion position, you have to be able to explain why what the woman's doing with her body when she has an abortion isn't actually something like that. It's not actually violating the rights of another being. And so it's not enough to say, my body, my choice. You also have to say that this is a particular thing you do with your body that doesn't violate the rights of an individual. And my position is that the embryo, that neither the embryo nor the fetus, is an individual human being with rights. And so therefore, whatever you do to it doesn't count as murder or any kind of rights violation. That's a position that people find surprising sometimes. But if you really think about what it is to have rights, the American notion of what it is to have individual rights, the kind of paradigm cases we think of when we think of individual rights are things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. We call them individual rights because the idea is the individual ought to be able to go to disagree with other people, ought to be able to go his separate ways when he disagrees with other people, that the mass of society can't coerce the individual to conform. But that's a conception of rights that presupposes that we are individual agents who can go our separate ways, and therefore we ought to be able to. And so, but it presupposes that we are individuals who can act and who can do things with the world, that we can agree or that we can disagree. And all of this presupposes that we are physically separate from other people and capable of action independently of them. And that's just not something that's true of the embryo or the fetus. It will be true if it's born. Once it's born, it's now a physically separate individual that can begin to develop the capacity to act. But prior to birth, it's not an individual agent. It's an organic component of a woman's body. It may have a separate genetic code, which makes it genetically individuated from the woman, but that's not enough to make it individuated in the sense that's relevant for its having individual rights. If genetic individuation were what mattered for rights, then identical twins who had the same genetic code wouldn't count as individuals and wouldn't have rights, and that doesn't make any sense. So the idea is that to have individual rights, you've got to actually be an individual in the sense of an independent agent capable of acting separately from others. And that's just not the case with an embryo or a fetus. And so even though it's got a genetic code that's separate from the woman, that's not morally relevant for the perspective, for the question of whether or not she has the right to use her body in a way that causes its death. And so it's not like the case of somebody who says, I've got these hands, therefore I can do whatever I want and strangle you with them, because in this case, it's not another separate individual person who's dying because of it. You also asked about if men could have abortions, then I guess abortion would be legal viewpoint. That's kind of the feminist criticism of opposition to abortion as a manifestation of the patriarchy. And I don't agree with that perspective. First, I'm not a feminist. I think women should have equal individual rights, obviously, since I'm standing up here for abortion rights. But I also think that it's just not true of the motivation of people who oppose abortion rights, that, or at least it's not generally true of the people who oppose abortion rights, that it's because of misogynistic reasons or something like that. It might be true of some of them, I don't know. But I think that they have a ideological viewpoint that regards abortion as just as immoral and as something that you don't have the right to, and it comes out of their religious ideology. And I think that if for whatever weird reason men could have babies, they would be opposed to it as well. And you could argue, you could think about, well, what is it about their, where did their ideology come from such that they have this opposition to it? Maybe you could start to talk about certain kinds of illicit motives that went into the ideology in the first place on behalf of its founders. I don't know. But I think as at least the vast majority of mostly religious believers who oppose abortion rights, they simply think it's a sin to do it. And I think they're wrong. And I don't think you need to go into talking about whether they are or aren't sexist in order to explain why they're wrong. Some of them might be, but I don't think the majority are.
Yeah, it actually kind of reminds me of it's kind of a funny story. I have this friend who's like right-wing conservative, tradcath. When Roe v. Wade got leaked, he posted about it on Instagram and said, "Life begins at conception. This has nothing to do with my religious beliefs." And the moment they got overturned, he was back on Instagram and he goes, "Yes, the win goes to the children and to God," prayer emoji. And I just thought that was funny. I was like, he's really not selling himself here.
Probably not.
There's another thing I wanted to ask you. What was it? Yeah, I forgot actually. Yeah, I'll just continue on a different subject. So, in your book, it's clearly like an objectivist case for choice, which I thought was really interesting. It was really, it was a unique perspective. Why objectivism? What got you interested in Ayn Rand?
I'm sorry. So I first heard of Ayn Rand when I was in high school, and I was a competitive debater. I debated in this category called Lincoln Douglas debate. They debated philosophic topics. I read a bunch of different philosophers, and at the time, I disagreed with Rand on all kinds of things. I was actually left-wing Christian, but I came across her book Philosophy Who Needs It in rounds, which doesn't really sell her philosophy so much as explain why she thinks philosophy is important. And I thought it was a really compelling case. I recommend reading her essay, Philosophy Who Needs It. It's up on the website of the Ayn Rand Institute. And eventually, but that didn't change my mind yet. What changed my mind was her novel, The Fountainhead, which I started reading because of an essay contest sponsored by the Institute. And At first, I thought I was going to write a critical essay, but the book really won me over and changed my mind about a lot of things. That began an exploration of a whole series of philosophic questions for me, where I gradually compared and contrasted some of the other philosophers I'd been reading to Rand, and decided that her views on basic questions, especially in ethics and political philosophy at the time, I thought were just more coherent, more reality oriented, and eventually then went on to explore the rest of her philosophy, which I thought gave her views in ethics and politics a really solid foundation. And just her view, to sum it up in just a few principles, is that reality is what it is. It's out there, independent of our minds, whether we like it or not. If we want to know something about it, we need to use our reason. Our reason is our only means of knowledge. It's also our basic means of survival. And if we want to live, we need to discover the principles of basically scientific principles of ethics that can help guide our decisions. And so she thinks that rational self-interest is the basis for a code of morality, something that has previously been thought impossible by most moral thinkers, who assume that morality has to be some kind of impartial, selfless perspective. And she shows how there's really never been a rational reason for that. And if you reject that view, and if you accept the idea that no, morality is about living a flourishing life on Earth, that has implications for politics. It suggests that the role of government is to give us each the freedom that we need in order to pursue our happiness. And that's something like what the original American system was designed to do. And she was a great admirer of the founding fathers for that reason.
So a common criticism of objectivism is that it's pretty cultish. Do you see anything? Do you agree with that statement in any way?
Well, I've never had to swear any secret oaths or sign away my life savings or anything like that, and so I work from home and not locked up in a basement anywhere. I decided I liked this philosophy because it made logical, rational sense to me. And of course, it would be a strange thing indeed if a philosophy that advocated for individualism and independent thought really was some kind of cult. Now, look, there's nutty people who are associated with every philosophy. I suspect that some of the people who think that Ayn Rand's views are culty have met some of the nutty people who sometimes travel in our circles, but I think that that's not a fair representation of what the philosophy is actually about. And I think if you get to know people who are actually serious about Rand's philosophy, you find out we're pretty rational, ordinary people who don't participate in any kind of weird rituals, and we don't have any kind of charismatic leaders who demand our unwavering loyalty or anything like that.
I think it might have to do with the idea that if you want to be an objectivist, you have to agree with her on pretty much everything. Is there anything you personally disagree with Ayn Rand on?
Yeah, though, let me say first that I think it's still true that if you want to be an objectivist, you have to agree with objectivism. Objectivism is a philosophy, and it's a kind of trivial point that every philosophy has certain principles, and if you accept those principles, you believe in that philosophy, and if you don't accept those principles, then you don't believe in that philosophy. But it's not like getting to be an objectivist is some kind of honorific title that entitles you to special rights and privileges. It's just it's the identity of what you believe in. And so, I mean, you can say the same thing about any other philosophy. Like, if you want to be a Marxist, there are certain things you have to believe. If you want to be a Christian, there are certain things you have to believe. You want to be a logical positivist, you pretty much have to accept the empirical criterion of meaning and the analytic synthetic distinction. If you don't know, you're not a logical positivist. That's how logical positivism is just defined. So yeah, I mean, I think that to be an objectivist, you have to agree with the principles of the philosophy and be willing to practice them. But it's really important that the agreeing with the philosophy is not the same thing as agreeing with everything that Ayn Rand said. Her philosophy is the fundamental principles of her worldview, and that is not the same thing as her every opinion she ever uttered on, you know, what kind of art is good, or whether women should be president, or the, you know, psychology of homosexuality or something like that. So like, I don't have a long list of things that I carry around with me that where these are the things I disagree with her about. But yeah, there's all kinds of and I don't have a number of how many, but there's certainly positions she took on politics and morality and culture where I didn't necessarily agree. But when I don't agree with her, it's because I think the fundamental principles should be applied in a different way, and we just have a different opinion about where the facts fall on that kind of question.
What about some of her influences? She seemed to have a positive opinion on Barry Goldwater, for example, Aristotle, H.L. Mencken. Do you have an opinion on those three, for example?
Yeah, so those are very different examples, because the Aristotle was an influence on her thinking, for sure. I don't think the other two were. I think she had a view of Mencken and of Goldwater, but she had formed her overall philosophic outlooks well before she encountered them and had a view of them. So she thought very highly of Aristotle. She thought he was the greatest philosopher in history. I certainly think he is up there. And it's hard to dispute. So I imagine you ask about the other two because it might be more controversial. She had a positive view of Mencken, but I don't think she wrote that much about why. So I can't really evaluate her full opinion. I think they maybe exchanged letters briefly in the 30s or 40s. I can't remember them very well, what they talked about. Goldwater is a more interesting case, and I know more about it because she also exchanged letters with him. She was favorable toward him as a political candidate in the 1962 presidential election, and she wanted him to win, and he didn't. And she thought that the reason that he didn't win was that he didn't stick by his own principles. At least he didn't stick by his individualist principles well enough and allowed religious influences into his thinking. Now, whether or not that's the correct diagnosis of why he lost, I can't say. But I mean, I think I agreed with her positive estimate of him to the extent that she had the estimate she did. I also agree with the things that she was negative about. And there's a lot we could say, a lot more to be said about that. Like, I think she may have been a little too dismissive of the coalition Goldwater was building with Southern conservatives to get more votes, and that had the effect of empowering, I think, probably some racists. I don't think that Goldwater himself was a racist. I think he was quite outspoken in his opposition to racism and segregation. He did vote against the Civil Rights Act. I don't think for racist reasons. He did it because of the provisions in the Civil Rights Act that would violate property rights, where private discrimination was outlawed. And I think he regarded private discrimination as evil, but thought that you should have the right to do it, just like Ayn Rand thought that late-term abortions might sometimes be wrong, but you should still have the right to do it. So I basically agree with a lot of her estimate of him. I don't know him myself well enough, or his story well enough to comment in too much more detail, though, than what I've already said.
I don't know much about him either. He's a new name to me, but he stands out for his views on abortion, kind of similar to Rand in my opinion, because he was clearly conservative Republican, but unlike the average right winger, he was pro-choice.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I said, by the way, I said 1962 presidential election. I should have said 1964. That was the one where he was running against Johnson.
Speaking of like influences on Rand, how about what do you think of Anton LaVey? Because he did credit Ayn Rand as an influence to Satanism.
Yeah, I've heard about this. I haven't looked too much into him. It's like I said before when we were talking about charges of cultism. There's a lot of weird people who are associated with any philosophy, and I think he would fall into that category with objectivism. I think that from the little that I know about him, his understanding of Rand is at best superficial. He takes things from her that sound like Nietzsche, and I think also like Nietzsche.
Yep.
And that is as far as it goes. So but he was an irrationalist. I don't think that he held reason as an absolute in the way that Rand does. He would have probably described himself as some kind of individualist, but not as the kind of individualist who thinks that what matters most is one's independent, rational grasp of the truth. He was more about whim worship and hedonism. That's the best. I don't know that much about LaVey, but to the extent I know a little bit about him, that's my guess is it's a pretty surface level admiration for Rand that he had, and not very deep.
I do find him really interesting. There's this quote that the Satanic Temple, which is not affiliated with the church, is saying they claim like on politics, they quote him as saying it's basically Ayn Rand's philosophy, but with like rituals. And but the church is saying themselves say that quote's out of context. And if you actually look at their website, they do have a lot of Satanists from like different political views, all the way from like liberal, conservative, and apparently they also have some like Stalinist according to the website, which automatically is a complete contradiction of objectivism. So the Randian influence would have to be a bit on like the morals, like self-interest, because they do believe themselves to be like a form of self-worship and self-interest. But I think he considered himself a Nietzschean, and if I remember correctly, Ayn Rand used to consider Nietzsche her favorite philosopher, but at some point she eventually considered his philosophy the exact opposite of objectivism.
That's basically right. She read him at a young age. Incidentally, not before she formed her own views. She had formed many of her own views already by the time she read him, I think, as a teenager. And her sister gave her a copy of Nietzsche and said, he's beat you to all your theories. And there too, her sister, I think, had a kind of superficial understanding of Rand's own views. There definitely are superficial resemblances, and Rand thought that Nietzsche was kind of inspired in his poetic expression. Certainly would have agreed with his critique of Christianity and of the morality of the Christian worldview, which is altruism. Nietzsche had some really good criticisms, but when you turn to look what is his actual positive philosophy, there the resemblance becomes harder to find. He certainly didn't believe in an objective reality independent of our minds. He didn't think that reason was our only way of knowing something about it. He was a kind of voluntarist who thought that the world is governed by a blind, irrational force that he called the will to power, and that I mean, he doesn't really have a theory of knowledge per se that I am aware of, but certainly he doesn't think that the way to know things is through our reason. He, even when you get to something like ethics, there are certain things he says on from a positive perspective that have certain resemblances to Rand's views. He thinks that there's a virtue in the pursuit of kind of excellence, but he also thinks that it's true that it applies only to certain people, that only certain people are born with the capacity to be great, and others aren't. And so for the people with that genetic capacity for greatness, they should pursue their own flourishing and happiness, and others should be made to sacrifice for them, the ones who don't have the innate capacity for greatness. And that's definitely not Rand's view. She thinks that there's that we're all capable of greatness of our own type. I mean, not everybody can be a genius. Not everybody can be a sports star. Not everybody can be a successful entrepreneur. But everybody, she thinks, is capable of pursuing their own values and living and leading a life of happiness in one form or another. And so whether you actualize your potential is a matter of choice. And not everybody chooses to actualize their potential. But even those who don't aren't by that fact somehow obligated to the others who have. Nobody has the right to demand anybody sacrifice themselves to anybody else, in her view. So that's the fundamental difference with Nietzsche.
Well, one thing about Nietzsche, he actually did say that everybody does have the potential to be unique. So I think there's a bit similarity right there. But
well, to be unique, but
well, yeah.
not to necessarily achieve significant values that are the basis of some kind of meaningful existence, as far as I know.
Well, he was in favor of egoism and against altruism. As far as I know, I just know the one aphorism where he mentioned it. I'm not sure if he actually went into detail about it. Another thing they do have in common, though, is he was also a critic of socialism, but he wasn't exactly known for his politics. So again, it's not really a part of Nietzschean philosophy.
There's places where he says negative things about socialism, but he also never really defines his own positive view of what politics should be.
Yeah.
And so that makes it really easy for his views to be expropriated by the Nazis, like they were, because he was unclear on these kinds of issues.
Well, the problem with that was it was actually his sister who took his work and reworked into Nazi propaganda. Hitler had a bust of Nietzsche, but he never actually read Nietzsche. He even went as far as to claim that Nietzsche was not his guide.
Yeah, well, he was certainly, whether it was Hitler or not, there were certainly people in the Nazi regime who made use of what his sister was giving them. And I don't think it was all on her. I mean, there are things that Nietzsche says, especially about the idea that there are some people are born to be great and others are born to serve them. That certainly in the wrong hands can be used to justify some real evil.
Yeah, but he was also believed that the Jews were the ones that had a strong culture, and he did constantly criticize anti-Semitism. He criticized German nationalism. So really,
he also contradicts himself a lot. So like there are things where you can find him saying bad things about anti-Semitism and good things about the Jews, and there are other places where he says the opposite. So that's part of what comes with being a kind of aphoristic philosopher and not a systematic one.
Well, I'm not sure what contradicting things he said about the Jews. He seemed pretty straightforward most of his life, especially since a lot of his personal friends, were Jewish, and some of his issues with Wagner had to do with his anti-Semitism.
They did, yeah. I mean, the thing, his view of Jewish religion is it's got this tension in it, because on the one hand, I mean, he thinks that you're probably familiar with his idea of the slave rebellion in ethics. and the revaluation of values that comes with it. And he thinks that in antiquity there was this master morality that ruled, celebrating different forms of strength and virility as virtuous. But with Christianity, although starting with Judaism, there is a attempt to revolutionize the way we think about ethics, where what was once good is now evil, and what was once bad is now good. And so meekness and humility now are virtues, and strength and virility are evil. So on the one hand, Nietzsche admires the Jews to the extent that they were to kind of able to pull off this transformation. Like they put one over on the world by just reprogramming the way that we think about good and evil, and thereby gaining the upper hand culturally. And so he admires that. But at the same time, the code that they've now foisted on people is something he does not admire. If it's the slave rebellion, it's kind of making a virtue out of slavishness, which he doesn't himself admire. And so there are places where he says very bad things about people who are in that position, such that they would need to resort to this tactic.
I've actually read that he was working on I think it was like 4 books that was discussing master morality and slave morality, but he unfortunately didn't finish due to his in madness, which some people say was due to like syphilis, others say it was like brain cancer. I don't think anything's confirmed, but yeah, I read that on Big Think. So I'm not sure if what he was fully going to say about both master and slave morality. But
and I should say I'm not a Nietzsche expert or a Nietzsche scholar, so my knowledge of him and his views comes from having read a fair amount of him when I was in graduate school, and taken some courses from people who were scholars, but it's not my first expertise.
Yeah, I love Nietzsche. His still my favorite, or Wilhelm, and then Chorin. But my problem with him is he's so damn confusing. Just the way he speaks. But I guess that's kind of what he wanted, was for people to like look back and just think really hard about what he was trying to say. And let's see, what else should I focus on? So I guess we can talk a little bit about secularism.
Okay.
So, as we know, Ayn Rand was a militant atheist, and would you describe her as an anti-theist in the way like Hitchens would call himself an anti-theist?
Well, I should say that at one point she actually, I think, described herself as a intransigent atheist, but not a militant one.
Okay.
And I'm not entirely sure what she meant by the difference, but what I take it to mean is that I think she associated militant atheism with people like I don't know, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who made atheism the forefront and the centerpiece of their whole outlook on life, and made sure everybody heard about it all the time. Rand was definitely an atheist, and by intransigent, I think she means uncompromising. Like, she wasn't an agnostic. She had no belief whatsoever in God. So, and wasn't going to change her mind about that for lots of reasons we could talk about. But she thought atheism was a negative. It's not believing in God. Okay, but well, what do you believe in? And she thought that the principles that she did believe in were far more important than the ones that she rejected. And so that's part of why she wasn't a militant atheist. She was much more interested in advocating on behalf of her positive principles than she was on disabusing people of their belief in religion. Now, that doesn't mean she would pull her punches when the subject came up, or when it had an effect on the issues she was analyzing. So she wrote some very scathing critiques, for example, of several papal encyclicals. One on, in both of them by Pope Paul VI, who wrote one encyclical calling for a kind of global collectivism that was Populorum Progressio, and another one where he came out against contraception and abortion, that was Humanae Vitae. And she wrote scathing essays criticizing these encyclicals and offering her principles as alternatives to his views. So she had been scathing is putting it lightly. I mean, she calls the Pope basically evil for his views in those. So if you want to call that militant, okay. But the point is that wasn't, critiquing religion wasn't the centerpiece of her worldview.
A common criticism from the political right nowadays with all this wokeness and far left ideology is that this is due to a Christian-shaped hole in society. Do you think Ayn Rand would agree with that?
A Christian-shaped hole? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Do you think Ayn Rand would agree with that statement? Like we've lost meaning because we've lost Christianity?
No.
Okay.
And in fact, I think that she would say that many of the problems that conservatives themselves bemoan in our culture today are at least indirectly consequence of Christianity and religion, at least indirectly. And that's because a lot of the forms of subjectivism and relativism that you see on the left are, in lots of ways, just disappointed forms of Christianity. So they wanted a God who would answer all their prayers, and then he didn't do it. And so they end up finding ways to find substitutes for that in the form, for example, of a omnipotent government rather than an omnipotent being who will grant people's wishes, who will demand our sacrifices for the sake of that higher power. It's interesting you mentioned wokeism because I actually just released an essay a few weeks ago. I don't know if you saw it, called "The Old Morality of the New Religions," and it's about wokeism. And one of the things I argue for there, I'm talking a lot about John McWhorter's book "Woke Racism," which I think is a really great book. And McWhorter argues that the various quote unquote anti-racist, which I think is a misnomer, ideologies that conservatives lampoon as quote woke McWhorter argues that they are a form of religion, that they have saints, they have holy texts, they have a view of original sin, they call for sacrifice and atonement, and the thing I argue in my piece is that I think McWhorter is right, but if you really want to understand why it is that this ideology is so influential and powerful, and why so many seemingly educated, secular, otherwise non-insane people go in for it, is you have to see the role of Christian morality that makes a virtue out of humility and a sin out of pride. And what is animating woke activists is essentially a burning commitment to make people humble themselves and to be humble themselves. And that anyone who wants to declare that they aren't a racist, that they think that they judge people by people's character and not by the color of their skin, that's the sin of pride, to think that they can escape the irrationality of racism. And in just the same way that the Christians who said that if you think you can perfect yourself and achieve salvation through no grace from God, that's the sin of pride. It comes to the same thing. And so, I think that the major kinds of cultural maladies that the conservatives lament are at least indirectly, if not directly, because of Christian ways of thinking in that way. Now, there may be a certain point to what they're saying, in that if society abandons religion as its moral compass and lodestone, and doesn't replace it with something else, then that will cause nihilism and subjectivism and relativism and chaos of all kinds. But the problem there isn't that they don't have religion; it's that they haven't yet found an alternative. They haven't yet found a rational philosophic framework that they can use to guide their life. And I mean, I think there's an argument you can make that it's, if it's a choice between religious morality and nothing, yeah, it might be better to have a religious morality, so that at least that you have some kind of standards to decide what to do with your life. But that's a pretty low bar for what it is to have a better way. And what I would say is, yeah, maybe it's better to have that than nothing, but it's way better than that to have something that's actually rational. And if we want to teach young people today how to find meaning in their lives, we need to teach them how to find scientifically based principles for what it is to live a happy life, not just come up with more ways for them to sacrifice.
All right. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna just end this with just some 4 simple questions, just a few quick opinions. So, who would you say is your favorite founding father?
Oof.
Just some random questions I'm gonna throw in.
I don't know if I have a well worked out view on that. There's a lot that I like about Jefferson. There are things I don't like about Jefferson. He's the one I probably know the most about, but I don't want to say that because the things I like about him I know better, that makes him the best. I guess, I mean, I'm biased by the fact that he was a kind of philosopher who wrote the Declaration of Independence and who was influenced by Enlightenment philosophy in doing so. But I mean, the fact that he owned slaves and didn't have the courage of his own convictions to do more to end slavery is the major flaw, obviously. And so when I put aside my bias in favor of philosophers, I end up admiring Washington even more, because he was a man of action who had the really full courage of his convictions to fight for what he believed in, which was the ideas of Jefferson. And in a way, I think he had more integrity than Jefferson, because he freed his slaves, and so it's. But I'm not a scholar of this period, so I can't say too much more.
Oh, okay. Next question. What do you have a favorite president?
There, I'd probably have to go with Washington again for the same reasons, especially because of the fact that he was offered power at the end. He could have, if he wanted to, he could have made himself king. But in the tradition of General Cincinnatus, returned to his farm in Virginia and set a really important precedent for the body politic.
All right. Third question. Can you give me your top 3 book recommendations?
Well, you know, because of who I am and who I work for, I'm probably going to add a few Ayn Rand titles to that list. So the first one I would say, probably for most of your viewers, is, well, let's say the one that got me interested in the first place, which is Philosophy Who Needs It, which is not primarily about her philosophy or what it stands for, though that comes up in a secondary way. It's more about showing how important philosophy is in our lives and why we need to know something about the fundamental ideas that move history forward. The second is going to be The Fountainhead. That's the one that changed my mind about so many things. And made me realize that if we are allowing other people's views to dictate our basic choices of values and standards, that we're not really thinking for ourselves. And that has all kinds of implications for how we think about morality. And if I would pick a third book for your audience, I guess it's just going to have to be Atlas Shrugged, because that's the book where she lays out a really systematic view of life. And it's a epic, dramatic story about a mystery, about what happens when the motors of the world stop working, and why did they stop, and what caused someone to want to stop them. And that mystery then moves forward and propels the main character's own inquiries and gets them reevaluating their basic premises in life, although they're right about some things, but it turns out wrong about others. And the main drama there is especially the two characters, Dagny Taggart and Hank Rearden, how they reevaluate their own lives in the course of trying to solve this world scale existential mystery that they see unfolding around them.
And last question, are you working on any new books at the moment?
Yeah, as it happens, I am, and quite relevant to a lot of things we were talking about today. I am working on a book about the religious roots of altruistic morality.
Oh, okay.
My idea is that the conventional morality, what Nietzsche called the slave morality, which is the morality of Judeo-Christian thinking, is also the morality that influences a lot of secular people today. I think it's essentially the morality of utilitarianism, effective altruism. They all think that what it is to be moral is to make an impartial estimate of other people's interests and work to achieve that, regardless of your own interests. And I think they see themselves as rationalists and secular people. I think that their morality is basically Judeo-Christian morality. They don't realize it. I'm trying to argue that that's the case, that there is that connection, and that if they really want to be the secular rational people that they think they are, they need to reevaluate the moralities that they are accepting from their wider culture. And I think there's a chapter that I'm working on right now that's due to be released soon in our publication New Ideal, because again, this book will be a collection of essays, and the article that will be released is about the effective altruist movement, and how, especially if you look at the scandal that has plagued it recently because of the collapse of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, you look at the version of effective altruism that he advocated, and that people like William McCaskill advocate, this long-termist view. It's really got all the marks of a religious ideology, that we need to forget ourselves in the present and sacrifice for the future, for the sake of the millions of people we will never know, or maybe even for certain digital beings who will somehow evolve and acquire consciousness of their own. It's really an essentially religious idea, and it's not an accident, I don't think, because I think that the basic moral idea comes from religion and has no real scientific basis. And I explain why in the article. So that should be coming out in a few weeks. So stay tuned.
All right. So if you don't mind, we'll end it here. I really appreciate you coming. It was really nice talking to you.
Yeah, it was great to talk with you, Rawling. I look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
All right, thank you. All right. Goodbye.